Welcome to the second part of Chapter 4, YMT 220 Economics. So, a previous part or first part of this chapter was discussing how markets work and actually the forces of supply and demand. In the previous session, we discussed the demand in details. So in this session, we will discuss supply, and actually next to that, we will discuss supply and demand all together. So what's the idea of supply? As we explained in the previous session about demand, initially we need to define few terminologies so that we can understand the next part of the explanation. Quantity supplied. Actually, quantity supplied is the amount of goods or services that sellers are willing and able to sell. What does it mean? It means that in any community or anywhere in a free market, we have sellers or producers of goods and services. They have limited ability of producing goods or services due to the scarce resources in terms of the input or the factors of production, and also in terms of their labor ability, or whatever you can call it. So basically they have a limited ability in producing goods and services, plus willingness. In some cases they may change their willingness based on the amount, or for the amount that they are going to produce or they are producing at the moment, and we will see how. The law of supply, as we explained for the law of demand, when we stabilize or when we hold everything constant except the price and the quantity of a good, what happens? So if we hold every factor constant except the price, what happens to a certain supply of goods? If the price goes high or rises, the quantity supplied will be also raised, or will be also increased. Why? In basic sense, when we discuss a certain market, let's say, take any example, let's say the market of coffee. Let's say for some reason the prices went up high. For some reason, I will not speak about the factors now. This increment will encourage producers to produce more because they will earn more, most likely. And that will make them put up their own production, and due to that the quantity supplied will be higher, will also rise. All right, so similar to the idea of having the demand schedule and the demand curve, we apply the same to the supply. So we have something we call supply schedule. It's actually the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. Now we don't speak about demanded, we speak about supplied. That means we speak about supply in this case. And we can transfer this schedule or table into a graph. In that case, we will have something we call supply curve. So it's just a graphical representation of the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. In that case, we can have a visual illustration of this relationship. We may start discussing the supply in a market by just addressing only one seller, and this is a good idea to start with. Why? For its simplicity. We can visualize how the supply is manipulated, or how actually it's formed in a market. Now let's just discuss the table on the left here. Now look, assume that we have a seller, only one seller of an ice cream, and as we explained in the previous session, that it's just an item, it's just a good that people consume, and it's easy to explain about it and reason things related to it. At a price of 0, the seller is not willing actually, and also not able to supply. Why? Because he would just lose. Maybe at certain also value like 50 cents, the seller may not make any profit, and for this reason will not sell. At certain price level, there will be a certain quantity supplied. Why? It depends on the margin of the profit, and that's why it increases as the price also increase. So the price, once the price increases, the quantity supplied also increases, and this will create what we have here as the supply curve. It's very similar to the demand curve, however, it's going to the exact opposite direction. If you remember, the demand was like this, the highest exactly at the lowest cost or the lowest price, and then it goes lower, lower, lower at the lowest, I'm very sorry, the lowest quantity at the highest price, and it goes lower, lower, lower. I'm sorry again. At the highest price we have the lower quantity. I'm very sorry, I a bit got myself confused. At the highest price we have the lowest quantity. So let's say at 3, maybe no one is interested in buying any, and that's for the demand. And then we go directly down based on the prices until we reach to the maximum demanded quantity when the price is null or extremely low or maybe 0. So supply is opposite. Actually, it starts from 0 or somewhere. It's not necessarily 0 because we cannot supply actually in 0. So we start somewhere, maybe 50 cents or something like that, and we keep on moving up. So it represents a different type of slope, positive and negative slope. So you can try to remember the demand and supply as an X actually, and we will see them. So this side of X letter is actually always the supply, and the other side or the other part of X is the demand. Well, let's just carry on. Now, as we explained a bit earlier, any increase in the price of the good or a service, a good or a service increases also the quantity supplied. So this is what happens: increase, increase. That is how we reason it. Okay, usually in competitive or perfectly competitive markets, we don't have only one supplier, and that's not possible. So what we do is we have actually the sum up of all individual suppliers, and these suppliers compose their own supply curves, and what happens is we sum up horizontally and we get the total supplied quantity as a curve also. So, well, the total, you can say, sum up will produce the supply curve, and it depends on many actually factors that influence the price of a good or service, and we will see how this goes. Now let's assume that we have two, and as I said, this is just for simplicity. We may have two sellers of an ice cream in the market. Why do we assume such a scenario? For just simplicity, to see or to visualize how we can sum up. Now we have also the supply schedule, and this one we addressed earlier. Ben, let's say we have Jerry now, and these two we can sum up their supply at certain points so that we can draw or plot the supply of the whole market. It's easy, like what we did in the previous session. We can pick up 2 points. Let's say here at the price 1, Jerry is not interested in selling any. However, we have Ben is interested in selling at the price of 1. Remember here, let me check. The price of 1 is willing to sell 1, supply 1. So we can sum them up. So it will be at this one, it will be 1. So in that case, we will change. So it will start from 1, 1. Take another point. Maybe you can take maybe 7 or 3 or whatever and see. So you can sum them up, maybe 4 and see. So you can get 2 points and then connect all the dots. You will have the market supply. Now, maybe you will tell me, why are you explaining this to us? Usually we ask these questions. So if we are going to have an exam or a quiz, most likely I will ask you such questions like giving you two maybe supply schedules and ask you to represent the market supply. If it is a schedule, you need to sum them up. If it is a graph, you need also to find 2 points where you can connect them and plot the final supply of the market. All right, so let's move on. If there are 3, you have to sum them up, all of them, not only 2. So you sum them up, sum the points, sum what? Sum the supply at certain price. So let's say here we speak about 1 and 1. So we have 1 as a magnitude, okay, so the quantity, and 1 as the price. And here we have 1 as a price and 0 as a quantity. So 1 plus 0, that's a 1 exactly at the price 1. So it will be here, this part, like 1 and 1, and so on. Okay, let's move on. Now, what we explained in the previous session about demand. So we have a demand curve. What kind of action or what kind of movement may we have, or we may have on this curve or around this curve. So we can actually shift the curve based on some influencing factors, or actually some influencing factors may shift the curve to the right or to the left. It depends, and we will see how. Or also we may move along the curve by incrementing the price or decrementing the price. So an increment of the price or decrement of the price, so increase or decrease of the price, will just move along this supply line. However, we have other factors that make this line to shift to the right or to shift to the left, not actually move along the line. So we may think about a change as an increment or increase in the supply. Well, at certain quantity, let's say, if there is any change in the quantity demanded at certain price, if there is any change in the quantity demanded, we will have a shift. What does it mean? Let's say at price of $2, let's say, for one scoop of ice cream or 1 cone of an ice cream. Imagine that we are just looking for something like this. Previously, or in the beginning, we were looking for maybe 5 cones. Now we look for something more than 5, let's say 10. So what happens? There will be a shift to the right in the demand curve, in the supply curve, I'm sorry. And why? Because since the quantity demanded is higher than the normal quantity demanded of normal circumstances, there will be an increase and in the quantity supplied, and the supply curve will shift to the right. And this applies to the decrease in the supply. Let's say at certain price, if the quantity supplied at that price becomes less, for some reason, maybe the customers are not interested in buying some amount, or the suppliers are not able or willing to supply that amount. In that case, what happens? There will be a shift to the right, shift to the left in the supply curve. Have a look. This is the way. So at fixed price, certain price, if there is more supply, and now I said earlier because of the demand, actually it may be due to the demand or it may be due to the supply, and we will discuss them in a short while. So if there is an interest in supplying more at that price, what will happen? We will have a shift to the right, and if there is an interest from suppliers to supply less, the supply curve will shift to the, so we said right for the increase, left to the decrease. Okay. So what kind of variables or what kind of factors that make these shifts in the curve? We have the input prices. Now think about any good. We gave the example of ice cream. So what kind of input do we have? We have different raw materials. You may think about milk, you may think about flavors, you may think about sugar. many others. Also, you may think about the factors of production, labor, buildings, well, machines, so on. So if the price of any of these factors increases, what will happen? Maybe the quantity supplied will be less, and we will have a shift in the supply curve, and most likely it will happen like that. If the price of the input or any of these input factors goes down or actually falls, what will happen? Most likely the suppliers will be interested in supplying more, less cost, so they would be interested in supplying more, and we will have a shift to the right in the demand, in the supply curve. How about technology? Technology also shifts the curve of the supply to the left and to the right, depending on actually what kind of technology that we are using. If we are moving from you can say normal technology to an advanced technology, most likely the shift will be to the right. That means we will produce at lower costs. If we are going from advanced technology to actually a traditional or a lower grade technology, of course the shift will be to the left. Usually the producers do not lower grade their technologies, but it may be a case in some examples or some applications. However, the most common example is moving from lower grade technology to an upper grade technology where we save time and money and etc. And that's why the shift will be most likely to the right in the supply curve, more interest in supplying more. Expectations about the future, we explained this one for demand, now we explain it for supply. The expectation about the future, or things may happen in future, think about well, an expected increment in the price of certain goods, or an expect of a shortage of the goods in the market. What happens? So suppliers usually hold their patience and they keep their products until the prices, you can say, adjust to a higher prices than they supply their goods or services then. So the expectation also changes, may temporarily make lower supply and then next to that higher supply. It depends. Also the expectation may make more supply at certain point, less supply at another point in future. Number of sellers also affects the supply curve, similar to the demand curve. The more sellers we have, the more supplied quantity will be. The less sellers we have, the less supplied quantity will be, and this is very similar to the demand. So we explain about those. Okay. These are all the variables or the determinants that we have actually as influencers of the supply curve. Now what we have here is actually the movement along the line or along the supply curve, and I explained it earlier, the price of the good itself. For the inputs, they shift the curve depending on actually the prices. If they go high, they they shift the curve to the left. If they are actually decreasing or falling down, they shift the curve to the right, and the same goes to the rest of them. We explained about those. Let me just pass them. The equilibrium. So now we discuss about the supply and demand. So as I said earlier, we have something similar to the X or the letter X, but a little bit of you can say more steep angles. And in this case, what do we have? We have an intersection between the demand and the supply curves, and this intersection we call it equilibrium. Equilibrium is exactly a point where there is a balance between the supply of a good and the demand of the same good. And if we are considering the supply and demand as forces, and they are, what happens is we have an equilibrium between these two forces, a situation where we have exact balance. The quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. And this is exactly where our market balances itself, or what we refer to by equilibrium, or the point of equilibrium. So it's just like a stable price and stable supply of good. Well, as I explained it, like in this case, we usually call it in an economic term market clearing price. So the price at the equilibrium is the market clearing price. What does it mean? Because whatever we have supplied will be consumed by the buyers. So whatever supplied will be demanded, and that is exactly where everything will be cleared. So this is what we call market clearing price. Okay. So the quantity here, actually, as I said earlier, the quantity supplied will be exactly quantity demanded. So either one, you say the quantity supplied, in that case you are referring to the quantity demanded because they are equal at that point. Okay, have a look. So this is what I was referring to by the supply, demand and supply. Okay, so this is the equilibrium, their intersection. Okay, their intersection will be somewhere. It doesn't matter here. In this case, it's at price to 7 cons. It may differ from this, so it doesn't exactly matter where we are now, but just a representation. So this is the equilibrium. So the equilibrium price is $2. And at the equilibrium price, we have an equilibrium quantity by 7 cons, okay? And that's exactly how the market will balance itself. This will be the clearing price. Whatever supplied will be exactly demanded. There will be no any shortage or any surplus. So we will speak about these two terminologies. Surplus. Imagine that the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And this is a situation where the market, in the market, where sellers produce more than what buyers are in need of, or more than what buyers are willing or able to buy. So this is what happens is an excess in the supply, and this is what we refer to by surplus. In this situation, what will happen? Let me go to the curve and I explain about this on this curve directly. It will be easier for both of us, for you to understand and for me to explain. Now look, this is the initial equilibrium. At $2, we have 7 cones of ice cream as a demanded quantity and supplied quantity at the same time. Now, for some reason, let's say the price increases to 2.5. Okay, we are still having this equilibrium at this point, but for some reason, I will not say what kind of reason, just some reason, the price increases to 2.5. Now look what happens. If we intersect 2.5 with the demand, the quantity demand will be 4. Okay, and just extend the line and intersects it with supply. What happens? We will get the quantity supplied 10. Why? At the higher price, suppliers are interested in supplying more. At the higher price, buyers are interested in buying less. So this gap between these 2 points is exactly what we call surplus, excessive supply in the market and less consumption from buyers. So suppliers in this case have to cut their supply so that they can catch up back again with the market balancing, you can say, price, or manipulate the available, you can say, quantity, so that maybe they manage to reach to a new equilibrium, maybe shifting this supply. Now look, this supply may shift to this equilibrium, to this point, so we can move this whole line to intersects here. We will have a new equilibrium, or maybe we can shift the demand upwards here until it intersects with this one, and then we will have a new equilibrium. Now you will tell me, or you may ask me, how can we determine which one of these will move? It depends. It depends on many factors. It depends on the type of the product or the good or the service we are discussing. It depends on whether buyers can give it up or not. It depends also on suppliers, whether they can hold their patience or not, or they can still produce it at a lower price or not. So the pressure will be somewhere where that maybe both the supply and the demand curves will shift and we will have a new equilibrium. Maybe somewhere here, somewhere here, somewhere here, maybe here, maybe here. It depends. Okay. We have another term or another situation, we call it shortage. So shortage is exactly when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. What does it mean? We have an excess demand. So this excess demand creates shortage. And the problem in this case, what will happen is we have a higher quantity demanded. However, the supply is much less. And this happens when the price drops down. So initially the price is 2. Imagine if it drops down to 1.5 and we know at 1.5 we have higher quantity demanded than cons. However, if we intersect the 1.5, this level, with the supply curve, what we are going to have is 4 cons. So we have quantity supplied 4 and quantity demanded 10. We have a gap 6 in between. This is a shortage in the market, and shortage creates, you can say, long queues in the market. People have to queue up to get, and a lot of them will not be able to get the good or service. Now, maybe I can give you a good example of, in the time being. Let's say there is a huge demand for having the gloves, maybe the masks. People have to queue up to get them, if they can even. And that, for that reason, there is a pressure on the supply and the demand curves, and we may need to reach to a new equilibrium. Most likely this demand will not move to this direction, will not shift to the left to reach to this equilibrium. No, rather, actually what will happen is the new equilibrium most likely to be in this side due to some force. Maybe the supply will be enforced to produce more, and usually this price, if it drops in such a situation where we have a huge demand on like things, essential things like masks and hand gloves, usually there is like a control from the government. I will not explain about the control of the government as a factor now. However, usually this kind of force, you can say, shifts the supply to move to this direction. All right, so let's not go to that factor now. However, just try to understand that these two cases, the surplus and the shortage, are usually temporary in the market. What does it mean? A market cannot hold, a free market, perfectly competitive, cannot hold for any good or a service, cannot hold the shortage or surplus of any good or service for a long time. Usually it is temporary until some conditions are adjusted and new equilibrium happens. Maybe the prices will be pulled down, maybe the supply quantity will be pulled down, maybe the demanded quality will be pulled down, or the other way around. So these are all possible outcomes. We have something we call it the law of supply and demand. We explained about the law of demand and the law of supply. So we have the law of supply and demand all together. So the price of any good adjusts based on, actually, as I said earlier, the idea of having an equilibrium. So shortage and surplus in any market are temporary. So the price of any good or a service will adjust to bring the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded for a good to a balance. That means there will be an adjustment. We may have a new equilibrium, but we must have it. Ultimately, we will have it somewhere. So in most markets, usually, as I said, surplus and shortages, surpluses and shortages are actually temporary. They will take some time due to some situation, exactly like what we are having now. You may think of the situation now where you look for maybe a mask you cannot find, but it is temporary. It will take its time, and then we will have a new equilibrium of the market of masks. Maybe the same goes to hand gloves, whatever, synthesizer, all these goods that people are too much interested in at the moment. All right, how can we analyze the supply and demand? So altogether, we can have an analysis based on these three important steps. First of all, we need to think, or we need to find out what kind of shift or the event that is going to shift the supply curve, or is going to shift the demand curve, or maybe both of them at the same time. So we may have events that shift actually the supply curve, and we may have other events or situations that shift the demand curve. While in some cases, as I said, both of them together will be shifted. Okay, so we need to see if we find out that the supply curve is going to shift, what kind of shift? So the second point or the second step we need to address is the shift to the right or to the left. So we need to know, is it an increase or decrease in the supply or the demand? Okay. Then we need to use the supply and demand diagram. So we need to plot actually, and then check the initial equilibrium and see the new the effect on the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Okay. So well, let's take a practical example. Imagine we are speaking again about the ice cream, and let's say in one summer the heat strikes too much high, or the weather becomes extremely high. So what happens? The tastes of people change. That means they would be interested in something to cool them off, like ice cream, one of the items that people usually consume to cool them down. Okay, so this hot weather in this case will shift the demand curve, the tastes. Now you will tell me, how do you know demand, not supply? Well, supplier will not change their supply due to a hot weather. This is not usually the case. You may tell me they will change because there is a demand. Yes, but it is initiated by the demand, not by the supply. Why? The taste of people changed. So these tastes of the buyers, once they change, there will be like a new scenario for the supply. Okay, so the taste changes, the demand curve, and the curve will shift to the right. That means there will be more demand quantity, and due to that we will have a higher equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. Now have a look. So this is the initial equilibrium. At 2 we have 7 cones. Okay, this is the initial equilibrium. Now this one, D1, will move to the will shift to the right side. Why? Because the tastes of people have changed due to the hot weather. So what happens is we will have a new equilibrium, new intersection between the demand curve and the supply curve, and due to that we will have a higher price of the item or the good and a higher quantity at that equilibrium. Now supply didn't change. Actually, we are still moving on the same supply curve. We just what is changed here is the quantity supplied. Supply itself is never changed. What changed is the demand. Demand shifted. However, we are moving along the supply. It's just the price changed. That means the quantity supplied is changed. The same supply curve is still there, and more demand in the quantity, and that's what creates a new equilibrium. The same goes to other way, or maybe other reason or other factor. Maybe we can think about supply. Again, maybe in some season like summer, maybe a hurricane destroys the sugarcane farms or crops, and this increases the price of sugar. Sugar is one of the main ingredients in ice cream, and that creates an increment in the price. So when you have an increase in an input factor, one of the main input factors of the production factors in the ice cream, that will shift the supply curve. It's not the demand. Actually, here nothing changes the demand. So the supply will change due to a change in or an increment in the price of one of the input factors, and that will shift the supply curve to the left, because here suppliers will be interested in supplying, or actually would be willing or maybe able to to produce or to supply less. And due to that, we will have higher equilibrium price and lower equilibrium quantity. Now have a look how you may tell me how higher equilibrium price and at the same time lower equilibrium quantity. Now hold your patience. Now this is the initial condition. We have at the price of 2, we have 7 cones of ice cream. Now look, supply shifts to the left due to the willingness or the ability of supplying less because of an increment in the price of sugar. So this is what will happen. A new equilibrium. Now see, higher price, lower quantity. And this is what I was explaining earlier. That's how these forces actually control the market. They bring a new equilibrium based on the movements in demand and supply. Now look, for the demand, we never change the demand while it's still stable. Nothing changes the demand. The only thing we do is moving along the line. So we were here, now we are moving here. Imagine this is an arrow. So we're moving to the new point here. And we have a new intersection, which is new equilibrium that composes a quantity of 2 at the price of quantity of 4 cones at the price of 2.5. All right. So what are these prices actually? So if we kept telling about the price. So price in free markets, or actually perfectly competitive markets, are considered as signals. What kind of signals? Signals that allow and help people to perfectly, or you can say optimally, allocate the scarce resources. What does it mean? Now imagine we have a good or a service. Who will buy it? The one who checks the price and sees that it is fitting his own budget. So the one who is appreciating it more and able to buy it at the same time will own it, will get it. And at the same time, the one who's producing this good or service will be the one who is able and willing and able most to produce it at that price. And that's exactly what controls the market. Prices control the market, and even if there is a shortage of certain item, it will be just temporary. Even if there is a surplus of certain item, good or service, then it will be temporary until rebalancing the market happens, new equilibrium will be achieved. And that's exactly how prices control the markets, based on just rebalancing the demand and supply curves and having equilibriums based on exactly the available prices. All right, this is the end of this session. I hope you guys enjoyed the session and I hope you will benefit from it. Until the new session, have a good time. Goodbye.